Thank you. So today we have the second session of our regulation. Yeah, the next slide is fine. And the one afterwards as well. For the ones new, we're in this training, which had five sessions on policy, and now we're into regulation. Yesterday, we gave an introduction about regulation. Today, we're going to dive into the tariffs. We have a couple of external speakers, come back to that in a second. Be active like you were previously, and especially yesterday. That makes it super interesting. Even if we don't manage to tackle everything, then I've agreed yesterday that those presentations that we can't make, that I would record them, and then you can still see the recorded version afterwards. After the training sessions, somewhere next week, you will receive the training certificate. And then everything will be available on the Go platform as soon as the English version of the platform is available. It's currently only the French version that seems to be working, so they're on it. And then, as always, there will be the evaluation form, which helps us not only for these sessions, but also for the workshops afterwards in March. Okay, next slides. So today we are in session 2, 6th of December, on utility rate design and customer responses to utility pricing. And tomorrow we're going to dive more into how we can use regulation to ensure a higher deployment of renewable energy and of energy efficiency. Next slide, please. So for today, can I move to the next slide? No, I can't. Laura, can you give me the next one?
Yes, I'm sharing it.
Yeah.
Can you not see the change?
No, we don't see a change. No.
Okay.
Yeah.
Stop sharing.
So we're going to start today with first a presentation by Constantin. Constantin is from DNV in the Netherlands. They've been working on tariffs, tariff setting, so the regulatory approaches to tariff setting and utility rate design throughout the world, let's say it that way. Constantin is Bulgarian, but works from Germany. And he's very keen on answering all your questions. So you can dump your questions on it. You can interrupt him. You can use the chat window as you feel that suits you best. But I mean, he has a bunch of experience that he can share. So just use that experience, use that opportunity to get answers to all potential questions that you have. Then Mariken is going to explain about affordability, which is a big topic. So Mariken is from Bonaire, Water- en Energiebedrijf Bonaire. And she will be sharing her experiences on that. And then as a third speaker, we have Christina, who's also working at DNV. And she will look already into a topic that is of relevance also for tomorrow, but dive really into US island case studies. And she has a lot of experience with cases such as Puerto Rico. So how do you set it up again after the hurricane? So again, don't hesitate to use that experience. There is another presentation. If we need to dive into it, then we can do. If not, then we can always either use it for tomorrow or I record it and then you have it afterwards. So use the opportunity today to have, I think we have some exceptional speakers. So I invite you to be active today. And if not, I'm going to make you being active anyhow. So looking forward to it. And I'm giving the floor to Constantin.
Many thanks, Len, and good morning or afternoon. Actually, for us, it's almost good evening now. Indeed, we'll be talking about tariffs now. And as Len said, we've been working more than 25 years already in this tariff regulations, so economic regulation, what it's called. And what you see is kind of, you can say, a summary of good regulation or major principles, how we're setting revenues and then tariffs. But obviously, that's a big, really area. And I'll be very happy, as Len said, if we can discuss or have questions. We've done a lot of, personally, I've worked in more than 50 countries, and some way there is also part in the Caribbean islands. I remember we done also work in South America, of course, a lot in Europe and also Asia. Yeah. Now just try to share the slides. Just probably good to tell me whether you can see them.
We see them in not yet in presentation mode.
Try to click here. That should be now probably bigger.
Perfect. Yeah, perfect.
Excellent. Yeah. Then the tariff is a regulatory tariff setting we set, and thinking also of tariff setting is good to put it a bit in the context also of the role of the regulation. Yeah, why we have regulation, you know this actually, but just to put it a bit in the context. And regulation is not only price setting or price regulation, it's much broader. And we have also other areas. But for sure, when we just say regulation and we're thinking of economic regulation, the first thing which comes to kind of our mind is directly the tariff setting. And thinking of tariff setting, actually, there are two major steps. Yeah, that's why you see in the agenda now 2 and 3. There are 2 points. The first one is the so-called setting of the allowed revenues. Yeah, I mean, if you have a regulation in terms of tariffs, first you have to say what is the allowed income, or the so-called really revenues, which are called in the professional language. So the allowed revenue is first set, and then we'll have to just see how to really allocate, so to attribute the elements of this allowed revenue, so the cost components, to different cost drivers, so called chargeable quantity sometimes in the regulation. It means just to establish tariffs, yeah? And there here a couple of things which we have to consider when we start thinking of tariff setting. So it means this allocation process of costs kind of, let's say, is a long chain. If we want to go for really good tariff setting, reasonable tariff setting, we'll have different principles and also really requirements here. And we have practical steps. So that will be just the third point. And then at the end, there is one point which is always kind of, let's say, bothers regulators but also policymakers, especially politicians, governments. It is related to customer protection, and the customer protection is a reaction of specific issues which are related to affordability or to poverty or low income population groups. At the end, actually, is all this related to impossibility to pay even kind of, let's say, you can say cost reflective tariffs because of the financial situation. And there are different views here in terms of regulation, whether we should help through the tariffs or not. Actually, good regulation will tell you that actually the tariff should not be distorted too much, because if we distort tariffs, we distort signals. But social protection or customer protection measures are important, and they can be somehow also connected to the regulatory tariff setting. That's why you have also here this fourth point, and just 2 or 3 slides. That's not the major topic, but happy just to discuss. We've done a lot of work in this area in different types of really measures and type of tariff setting, with cross subsidies, with direct subsidies, with increasing block tariffs, everything what's related to these protection measures. Yeah, at the end. Now, starting, I mean, as Len said, it will be good just to have it interactively. Yeah. I'll be happy. It should be not monologue. It's better just dialogue or kind of, let's say, interaction. Yeah, it's not kind of professor lecture here. It's more actually really just workshop with a kind of operating style of workshop. Then if you have a question, I don't see your hands, but probably just kind of, let's say, raise your voice or something, yeah, just to know that you're asking, and then we'll just discuss and I'll stop. And I mean, at the end, actually, the presentation, you can look at the slides afterwards. In any case, this presentation could be very long if we go for every single detail. The point is just to have the major orientation here and the major steps, which are required by good regulation. Now, starting with the first objectives of regulation, as already said, the regulation has a specific role. If just normative literature in the economics, they will tell you, it will tell you, we have to regulate when there is issues with the proper market functioning. Yeah, there are different really just so-called market failures. Yeah, when markets cannot operate. Yeah, well, or reasonably well, and one of them is nature monopoly, typically connected with the electricity business. Some areas actually of the business when we cannot really establish competition, for example, the networks. But in many cases also, even if we can establish competition for different reasons, we can decide not to have competition. And for example, for islands, one classical reason not to think too much about competition in the classical sense, what we have, for example, in some of the countries in the world, it is because small size of the systems. Yeah. So it doesn't make big sense really just to think of day-to-day competition, operating pools, so kind of, let's say, wholesale markets with balancing, all these things which we have in some countries with a lot of sophistication. So if we have to regulate, for these kind of reasons, then regulation is a balance, We can say that we have to find kind of balance, and this balance, these trade-offs, they could be on several levels. You can see here two of them, The first one actually is related to the companies and really consumers, So there's a classical balance or areas here, classical area of balance, because regulators should really find kind of this equilibrium to be in between and just to have a very balanced regulation. On one side, the customers want to see some price reduction, efficient cost, and protection against a monopoly use or monopoly abuse in this case, And on the other side, we have the companies, the utilities, they expect fair return, which is reasonable, get kind of, let's say, reasonable return in terms of profit, some opportunities, but also if there is a possibility to increase the efficiency to retain some gains of the effort, So there's a kind of, let's say, this balance, and it can lead, in many cases, to conflicts, because the two groups can insist on these really objectives or these expectations. Regulators in between, and depending how the regulator actually really acts, regulator can get also in conflict, typically with the utilities, but could be also even with consumers, depends on the situation. And there is another element of kind of, let's say, you can say, or another area of trade-off. It is related to the cost of regulation and to the expected benefits. On one side, if we just really establish kind of good regulation with a lot of rules and kind of, let's say, really scrutiny and also expertise and people, systems, that can help, It can help because it can really just promote efficiency. It can prevent from a monopoly abuse and also lead probably to lower cost. But this regulation can be expensive on one side, and probably more importantly, can become intrusive, in certain point, If a regulator starts really intervening too much in the utilities business, that could also lead to, in some extreme cases, to so-called micromanagement. So the regulator is taking over some operating activities which are actually unusual for the regulator or not kind of, let's say, typical, and that should stay with the company and the company's management. So this is again here active balance in terms of really what regulators should do to be efficient and effective, to have good regulation. On the other side, of course, not to be intrusive and not to be too expensive in terms of complexity of the rules and also the implementation. And as already said, there are different types of areas of regulation. Price control or price regulation, economic regulation is the leading one. I mean, people or economists thinking of regulation, they start directly thinking of price control, But as already said, there are many. You see here actually at least two other areas which are very important, depends on the situation, of course. Of course, price control is already set, but quality of supply, it's one actually also very important area. I mean, we will not achieve much if we have really efficient, low cost, but actually low quality. I mean, for example, imagine we have a lot of interruptions, So reliability of the system is not very good. We're interrupting frequently electricity supply. And we can say we have actually really low price and efficient cost, but obviously, I mean, quality is insufficient. So actually here the objective is to have the balance really between the quality, reasonable quality, adequate quality of supply, and also efficient cost. That's why this second area, quality of supply, is also very important. And is also a classical area of regulation where the regulators really set norms or standards for quality with different really regulatory models. And in addition, you can see also one third area called here market system, I mean, I called it market. Of course, if you have a kind of system which is integrated and there is no competition, it will be not market. You can say really just system in this case only. But it is related to some rules, technical norms, probably contractual arrangements, really their design, implementation, and also monitoring. And this could be also a task of the regulators. This one depends a lot on the specific industry structure, the specific arrangements, the size of the system. and the operational rules, but as already said, these technical rules, for example, to connect to dispatch, the so-called grid codes sometimes, metering codes, distribution codes, I mean, could be also that part of the really just also regulatory control. On the pricing side, it's a big science how to establish really price control. There are many methods, a lot of literature. One can think in this way, just for simplicity, that we have a rate of return, which is the first, actually, what you see here, the first bullet here. And there are other methods. You can put in here price, revenue caps, yardstick, or other performance-based. This kind of, one can group them as so-called incentive regulation, yeah? The first is rate of return is classical cost of service, more cost-based regulation. And the second group of many other subgroups actually can be called incentive regulation. And under this group, you can see different schemes or mechanisms with different degree of sophistication with one major role to promote efficiency. Thinking of efficiency, it means to establish kind of, let's say, you can say reasonable or low costs without deteriorating quality. And that's actually one of the major targets of good regulation, to promote, to encourage also the measures for companies to operate and to invest also in efficient way. So to have efficient cost is something which is really important. And it's also, you can say task requirement even, or expectations of any good regulation, how to do that. Now, thinking also of major steps, any regulation, incentive regulation or cost of service, rate of return regulation, is starting with the one big first step related to the so-called allowed revenues, yeah, or revenue setting process. I mean, when we say revenue, actually in this case, allowed revenues, it's meant really the costs which regulator would allow to include, yeah, in the tariffs, the regulated tariffs. And this cost, because a regulator would expect that they should be kind of, let's say, somehow efficient, reasonable, yeah? So we can see reasonable, efficient, different actually, prudent sometimes, different terms, sometimes a bit used in different contexts, generally in one direction of thinking and ideas, but with some nuances in the specific jurisdictions, yeah? But you can say here for our lecture, reasonable, efficient, we use them in the same way in this case, yeah? And these revenue requirements, what more is in America, United States, in Europe more we say allowed revenues, yeah? They actually have two major big cost blocks, you can say. One is the so-called operational cost, sometimes called OPEX in the literature again. And sometimes, and second group is the so-called capital cost, which really reflect the investments. Now we have to be very careful here not to mix the things. Sometimes you see the word capital expenditures, yeah, which is the so-called CapEx, yeah. This is actually really the investment volumes, and investments in assets. This money spent not for 1 year, but for the asset life of the relevant asset, yeah. So in this case, we cannot really transfer the money, in this case, the investment, in the tariff in this kind of, let's say, for 1 year. We'll have to really just transform them in annual equivalents over the asset life of this really specific asset. And this transformation, it reflects kind of the so-called capital cost of this investment. In regulation, the classical regulation, the capital costs, they have two components. One is the depreciation, and one is the return on assets. The first component actually aims to establish an allowance, so money, annually, yeah, which will be accumulating through the tariffs. So we collect this money through the tariffs, we accumulate them, and at the end of the asset life, we'll replace the asset with this money. So it means it's kind of, let's say, really allowance which we need to accumulate, and it will help us to replace the asset when the time has come. The second component, return on asset, in this case is really the cost of capital. So now it's another term, yeah? Capital expenditures, capital cost. Now we have a cost of capital, just with turning bit, but this is really just the money which the company needs to finance the investments. And because the funding in financing is coming either through the banks, so it is a debt capital which is not owned by the shareholders, that the debt holders here, the banks, or it's coming through equity shareholders, yeah. So in this case, we'll have kind of also mixing, yeah, of the funding, yeah. It will be coming from the banks and from the equity holders. And that's why the cost of capital will be reflecting the expectations of the banks, the interest rates on the loans, or the dividends, which will be expecting the shareholders, the so-called equity return or debt return. Regulators will be mixing this together with the so-called capital structure in between, the so-called gearing or leverage, yeah, and will calculate something which is called WACC, yeah, or allowed rate of return, no, but weighted average cost of capital is the word, which is again something which is could require even a couple of days workshops because it's a kind of complex variable with a lot of regulatory finance here, what is done in why. But you can think in this way, that is the allowed rate of return, yeah, which regulator would really allow to the utility to charge on the regulatory asset base, yeah. That will be now really the basis to charge the allowed rate of return. So return on assets will require two things, yeah. One is the percentage, the allowed rate of return, the cost of capital, and the base. This base, regulatory asset base, is typically the non-depreciated value of the assets which are used to provide the service of the company, the regulated service. In this case, if the company has generation and networks, transmission distribution, that will be really all this value of the assets together, and they will take them, the residual value, the non-depreciated value, and multiply them with the percentage, the allowed rate of return, and will get the return on assets. Return on assets together with the depreciation will be for us the capital cost. Capital cost together with the operating cost, it will be for us the allowed revenue. That will be the process in kind of, let's say, really in a nutshell. Of course, you can think that every single component here could be a subject to very heavy scrutiny or grouping the components. And this scrutiny in terms of efficiency analysis could have different forms, different ways, and also different size, different effort, yeah, and different degrees.
Konstantin,
yes.
On which time frame do you set these agreements? Because
yes,
of course there's a market link to it, a financial market. So if you say this allowed revenue is each time set for a period of 5 years,
correct, yeah,
then when a financial crisis hits, the interest rates might go up.
Absolutely, yeah.
And then that would limit the possibility to invest.
Yeah. I mean, that's a good question, actually. I mean, you can start in this way. Every regulation has a regulatory period, yeah?
Yeah.
Typically, I mean, rate of return regulation, what I just mentioned at the beginning, has a short regulatory period. Could be 1 year, could be 2 years,
okay,
could be
so
even actually
anticipates.
asymmetric, kind of initiative-based. But it is, you can say, generally short. Thinking of these caps, yeah, revenue caps, price caps, more incentive regulation, they have longer periods. For example, 5 years, yeah, 4 or 5. We had also on Rio 1 in UK, we had 8 years even, yeah, one case, yeah. But now they're moving back to 5, I think. And now the point is actually of this regulatory period is that you are setting the revenues, yeah, the allowed revenues, and these variables, you can adjust some elements, but everything is clear. So you've done it. You don't want to reopen anything more because that's incentive regulation. Yeah, especially when you have 5 years. Now, as you say, that could be a point if we kind of, let's say also set in this, for this period, the cost of capital. For example, as you mentioned, if we just set the WACC also 6% or something, yeah, for 5 years and actually freeze it, yeah, just it's set, yeah, because that's a regulatory period. And now, as you say, it can happen that for kind of reason, capital markets are changing. Even if we set the WACC on the forward-looking basis for the next 5 years, it can happen that in the second year or third year, we'll have changes in the capital markets, yeah? And in this case, then the new WACC, I mean, it will be proper to have lower or higher WACC, yeah? But we have already set it, yeah? Now that could be a conflict, as you said, and there are different actually points. One actually, or different solutions here. One is to say, we want to reset it, yeah? even we have longer regulatory periods, we can think of resetting, yeah, the WACC. And another point, actually, another model which is used, I think in Italy was using that also recently, is to have a really just a possibility to reopen, so that trigger, that kind of trigger scheme, trigger mechanism, which under specific circumstances would allow the regulator to reset the WACC. So it is not automatic reset, but the regulator can start the reset or can really go for the reset in case this trigger scheme kicks in. So it could be, for example, that inflation is high or interest is changing or something, yeah? So, or could be a threshold on the WACC level, yeah? So kind of it could be different really, kind of, let's say here, points of this trigger, which will kind of, this case, kind of, let's say, allow for the reset. The whole story here around this kind of reset is exactly what you mentioned, Len, is just to allow to adjust properly the WACC during the price control period and to avoid significant discrepancies, yeah? Yeah. That's kind of I mean, sometimes there is a big debate whether it should be done or not, because one of the kind of major advantages, or kind of, let's say, you can say, merits of the longer regulatory periods, yeah, in the incentive regulation is not to reopen the variables, yeah, just to set them and to keep them. But as you say, on the other side, we want to have adequacy of the variables and to avoid discrepancies. That's why on the WACC, but also other variables, we can also use different schemes to kind of, let's say, deal with this uncertainty and to allow for adjustments. No. We discussed actually these points. I mean, one specific element is fuel, which you see only in the cases when we have regulation of generation, yeah, which actually in the classical utility regulation, especially when you have small utilities on the islands, it is typical, yeah. I mean, in many cases, if you see the continental regulations, when generation is actually really liberalized, you don't see this fuel regulation too much, yeah. You see more network regulation. But when you have one utility which is really integrated, and because, so even not integrated, but we have kind of regulation on generation, because a small scale, there is no really market potential, no competition, then this actually fuel is also part of the regulation. And like any other cost, yeah, it should be scrutinized for efficiency. And it is related a lot to the efficiency of the power stations. What kind of efficiency? For example, thermal efficiency in this case, the technical thermal efficiency of the power stations, but also to commodity itself. So it means what kind of commodity we're using. For example, oil classically, or kind of, let's say, gas, LNG or something, yeah? And what kind of price we would allow? Do we want to see, do we have kind of market price quotation what we can use kind of in a reliable way? Just it somehow to connect with markets and to encourage efficiency of the procurement process. So that's kind of, let's say, here also specific for the fuel, and one should kind of always remember that fuel is also something important, especially when you have the regulation of generation as part of the utility regulation. We discussed actually already depreciation and return. Just to mention depreciation, you have different types of models in the classical financial accounting. In regulatory accounting, typically we see straight line. So it means you just take the assets and the asset life and you depreciate it over the asset life in linear way. You just divide the value by the time. So you have every year equivalent amount, yeah, of the really money for the depreciation allowance. Sometimes in the financial account, you have kind of accelerated or just as slower models for regulation, non-linear models. But I think in a regulation in classical sense, typically you just see that it's a straight line regulation to establish the depreciation allowance. In case of islands, it's just good to mention, because I think we're talking now about utilities operating in the islands. We have a kind of special properties, yeah. As already mentioned, we have actually small systems, yeah, and they're actually not really kind of characterized with the same classical scale economies what we can observe in a bigger power system. So that's one important point. And For this reason, we don't see a lot of unbundling, what actually you see in many of the countries, just to unbundle networks from generation supply and to have functional competition. All these actually ideas, they have always kind of as objective to have operating markets. But beyond these ideas, of course, actually, or behind these ideas, actually, it is really the large system, yeah? We have big systems in this case, and that's why we want to deregulate, establish competitive markets, all this stuff, yeah? In small system, it's not so actually, and in this case, we have to take also this into consideration. Social affordability and political acceptance, this to target to specific objectives, which I'll mention once again when we're discussing a tariff setting. That's important, is when you have small system, actually really small number of consumers. And also very kind of, let's say, often if you have really small territories, then you don't see really also regional price differentiation. So it means if you have large territories, you can see that different distribution companies who have different prices, but in small kind of, let's say, really geographical zones and areas, typically the price is uniform. Also the systems now, that's actually just more on the really market, or you can say the sector specific. Of course, if you go technically, you can see that in the technical operation in the small systems, of course, you have a lot of really issues which are very specific because of lack of interconnection. The whole really operation in terms of really kind of reserves and also dispatch is very kind of, let's say, specific and also really just driven by the local really generation capacity. You cannot rely much on the interconnection, what we're doing in large interconnected systems, yeah, when we have really exchange of reserves and you have typically kind of, let's say, really integrated operational zones, yeah. That's not actually the case here, also in terms of operation in small areas. And last but not least, also the fuel supply, it is very important because you don't have kind of the classical really supply when you have endogenous really just production of coal or kind of, let's say, gas, or really large pipelines when you get really connected the gas, yeah. So in this case, typically you have the really delivery, the procurement of fuel is actually coming from outside. And again, this fuel supply, the procurement is important, but also really the security of fuel supply is very important because it's coming just through the water in this case, yeah. That's another point which we have to consider also in the regulatory policy. Now, I think you can think in this way, then as already said, the price regulation simplified, it is in 2 steps. You establish the allowed revenues, what we discussed, just you simply take the cost components, you check them for efficiency, and you calculate the allowed revenues. And now in the next step, you really convert the allowed revenues into the tariffs. You can think in this way that revenue is actually something like money, but not money per kilowatt hour or per megawatt installed or per customer. So there is not a tariff, yeah? It is just money financially. Tariffs, they typically will be just kind of, let's say, allocating the allowed revenues in different ways to establish a tariff system or tariff structure. And in this case, it will be really just money per kilowatt hour or per megawatt or per something, yeah? And that's why we'll call it tariff, yeah? So this kind of, let's say, link, yeah, between this kilowatt hours and megawatts and the allowed revenues is done through the tariff setting. So just we have to simply allocate really the allowed revenues to the tariffs. And this tariff setting process, yeah, you can see kind of different types of objectives in the literature. I just tried to put here 6, yeah. You can see sometimes longer list, but I think that should be kind of sufficient for good regulation, yeah, if you see what is written here, yeah. The first 2 actually as the most important, I mean, the tariff should recover the allowed revenues, so it should be cost recovery. And second, the tariff should be also providing good signals. So kind of, let's say, really the so-called causality principle, they should be reflecting the costs which are necessary to supply electricity to the specific customer group. So cost recovery and economic efficiency are the 2 leading objectives of the tariff setting process. And
Konstantin,
you have some, yes.
Linked to the revenue recovery. If
yes.
I implement a tariff that is varying, let's say I have peak, or I even have
Yes.
3 different tariffs,
Yeah.
then I might face challenges in how customers will react to it. Let's say I implement it for the first time.
Yeah.
How do I anticipate that? Am I allowed to make a safety margin, or do I have to have a good guess, or how does it work in that case?
In terms of kind of the good tariffs, of course, ideally, I think it will be good just to have kind of, let's say, tariffs in terms of marginal cost. So it will be kind of, let's say, the cost, which, I mean, the first step will be that to think what is the cost which a specific customer group would really just calls in the system.
Yeah.
And it typically, they're kind of, let's say, a bit more forward looking. Yeah. Then you have to just try to adjust this cost to establish kind of, let's say, really revenue recovery. And now back to your point, of course, the reaction of the consumer, the so-called elasticity, yeah, it is important, yeah. If we're thinking, I have kind of, let's say, a bit afterwards discussion of time of use tariffs, yeah. So in this case, as you say, we differentiate, for example, the 2 periods of time. One is called peak time, for example, nights, and then, I mean, or kind of before the night, the evening, yeah, or in the morning, and then the rest is off peak, for example, yeah. And we believe that because it's a peak time, I mean, because of the kind of peak nature in this case, we have to really have more cost in this period to signal, yeah, that the system is close to the margin. So it means the tariff is high, yeah. Oh. And there is a reason to have higher tariff because we're dispatching more power stations which are more expensive in these peak periods, for example. So we can also allocate more capacity cost to the period. At the end, it's more expensive. That's the first point is from the supply point of view. So we are signaling in terms of cost reflectivity that the tariffs should be high. It's more expensive. But you're right now, we're expecting that the client will be paying that tariff, yeah? It can happen that, I mean, the client is really just kind of, you can say, when they're facing the high, the peak tariff, they react elastically. So it means they reduce the demand, yeah? And in this case, it can happen that we have some probably shortfalls of the revenues, yeah? That could happen, yeah? But typically, I would say elasticity of demand, it is done not so explicit in the tariff setting process at the very beginning, yeah? So I think one is experimenting with probably with some numbers, with scenario techniques to see exactly what is the tariff level. And then you can see also what is the historical tariff levels. You can see the demand also historically, and just to see whether there is a correlation, kind of, you can say mathematical correlation between the tariff levels and the customer demand, yeah. And that could be also probably something like indication, back to your point, Len, whether the customers can react, yeah, or kind of, let's say, really just stop not is a big word, but probably reduce considerably the consumption, yeah. In this case, one had to think probably just that, I mean, the very kind of cost reflective tariff can lead us to a reduction of demand and probably slightly adjust again the level, kind of secondary adjustment, to make the tariff probably less, you can say, kind of, let's say, provocative. I put it in this way now for the client, and just probably to keep a bit. But of course, you can think in this way that the tariff in the peak period has the objective to signal that it is expensive to consume in this time. Yeah. Also, demand reaction is not something which is not so unexpected, yeah, because that's what we want to do, to have a signal of the proper cost. But of course, as you say, on the other side, we have to recover the revenue, yeah. Yeah. So it should be kind of reasonable, kind of, let's say, also revenue recovery. At the end, in practical regulation, there will be always a difference of the allowed revenues and actual revenues earned. Yeah. And depending on the regulation model, we'll have an adjustment 1 or 2 years later to compensate for the difference. Yeah.
Robert asked a question in the chat window, which is, would you recommend that tariff groups for specific consumer segments need to be self-sustaining, or in other words, that cross subsidies between customer segments should be avoided, like between residential and commercial clients?
I would say the cross subsidies, it would be good to avoid them, yeah. it is in terms of normative really principles. I mean, that's actually is related strictly to the second principle, economic efficiency. Yeah, to have cost reflectivity, it means actually to have more really connection to the cost of the specific customer group. In practical regulation, there is always something, because it is not easy to exactly to fix the cost reflective level. It's not an exact science, but I mean, we have good cost allocation models and schemes. One can think, that, I mean, based on assumptions, we have a good approximated cost reflective tariffs, In practical world also, then we have other criteria, which you see now on the point 6, stability, stakeholders' acceptance, and there is also kind of a point related to the also affordability, which is in the last section of my presentation. These are not strictly kind of, let's say, related to cost reflectivity, but also criteria which can be considered, And sometimes we see also cross subsidies, Cross subsidies within one tariff group or between the tariff groups, One should know that they can help for affordability, but they distort. And it is a balance act of the regulator whether they want to kind of, let's say, to allow for major distortions or political the policymakers, or just to keep very clean cost reflectivity and also confront the consumers with sometimes high tariffs, That's kind of, let's say, active balance, But again, I would say from normative point of view, it's always good that a regulator first calculates cost reflective tariffs, and then as a second step, decide whether there is a need of deviation and what could be really just a reasonable deviation from cost reflectivity, and for what kind of reason,
Just perhaps to comment on this, indeed, I totally agree with the speaker. Thank you very much. And what we've seen across the region in some cases is that, whenever there's a cross subsidy, often the residential segment is favored. But that exposes the utility company to a high financial risk, because if the business clients implement strong energy efficiency measures, or if they implement renewable energy and their demand drops, the utility company will then have less revenues and certainly less profits if the residential segment was already subsidized. Indeed. It's very risky, I think.
Absolutely, I mean, just I'll mention here probably one additional point in terms of cross subsidies. Also, there is a difference whether we are cross subsidizing between two groups or within one group. Within one group, one can think, for example, classical cases within the residential consumers to subsidize through increasing block tariffs, and then just we are kind of charging consumption with actually consumers with higher consumption then with higher charges, and in this way just we're helping with the consumers with low consumption, thinking that high consumption consumers are more wealthy, so they can also afford more. Of course, you can argue whether this correlation is good or not, but I think that's the thinking beyond the increasing block tariffs. And that's again a classical case of cross subsidies, because in most cases one can measure the cost. There'll be no substantial difference of the cost, but we want to really just differentiate the price. I would say this is probably not always kind of, let's say, you can say very accurate in terms of implementation, but it is probably less problematic when compared with the other example, what you mentioned now, when we're just cross-subsidizing between industry and residential, then in this case, the distortion can be much is much bigger, and of course, with bigger consequences, in this case. Right, and now this kind of, let's say, tariff establishment of tariffs goes typically through several steps, The first one, actually, what you see here is the so-called functional or cost functionalization. So it means we just specify the cost per functional area of the utility. And it's typically done on kind of, let's say, aggregated high level when we say we have the generation cost, transmission, distribution on network if they have a small grid, and then also supply, And then we have the cost blocks. You remember them from the revenue setting. when we just have the fuel, OPEX, depreciation, and return, it means this is a capital cost and operating cost. They're now allocated properly to the functional areas. So we can have a matrix in this case when we just really put the cost properly in the functional areas, and we prepare them just for the upcoming cost allocation process for the tariff purposes. And now, in simplified way, I just try to go kind of, let's say, in a major diagram, which kind of really aggregates the cost. One can really go very deep kind of in every single kind of element, but I think for illustration purposes, this is, I think, is pretty reasonable. Again, starting from this cost functionalization, so allocation of cost to functional areas in step 1, what I mentioned in the previous slide. You have the generation, networks, and retail supply, and the cost component. Once we have established this matrix, now we are moving to the second step, which is called cost classification. Now, this second step means that we have to now really classify the cost in terms of nature, so in terms of dependency. And this means now that we are separating the cost blocks further in at least 3 groups, yeah? And this actually kind of allocation is based on the fact whether this costs are energy dependent, demand or capacity dependent, or customer dependent. So we just in this case already start thinking that this classification in terms of driving the cost, yeah, energy, demand, or customer, it is already relevant for the tariff setting process in the next step, the last one. That's why we're looking already kind of seeking this classification in this way that we prepare the cost blocks in terms of really, you can say, dependency, and attribute them to these 3 types of groups: energy dependent, customer, and demand dependent. At the same time, also we go for another actually reclassification or kind of allocation of cost. You can see that here, network level 1, 2, or 3 by voltage level of supply, yeah? And we do this actually because you can think that the system has a kind of certain logic of hierarchy or cascading, yeah? We're starting from generation, and we go from medium voltage levels, high voltage, down to low voltage level to the consumers. So it will be good to understand that customers are connected to the voltage level 1 or 2 or 3 because the cost which are really relevant for their supply will be different. You can think in this way that if the customer is connected to the low voltage, the customer will be using the whole really grid from generation to the final point of connection. But if actually the customer is connected to the middle voltage, in this case, the low voltage grid is not necessary for the supply of this customer. That's why we have to know that the connection point actually for the second type of customer is not low voltage, but is middle voltage. And this will help us, again, when we establish kind of calculating the cost of supply of the different customer groups. That's why in this second step, we're just undertaking also this additional allocation or kind of classification of the cost by voltage level. And once we have prepared this kind of cost classification or all this kind of, let's say, attribution of the cost to different voltage levels or kind of, let's say, different drivers of cost, energy demand or customers, we can now really just establish the tariff system, which is the last one, when we'll be allocating the cost to the customer groups. And then for this reason, we have to have first specification of the customer groups. We have to know how we segment the customers. Which are our customer groups, yeah? Industry, commercial, residential, agriculture, tourism, government, budget, military. So it could be a long list. And sometimes actually this list is not directly automatically kind of related to the nature of the consumption. Could be different reasons to have specification of the clients, yeah? Typically, the factors which have a kind of specific substantial role when we decide on the customer specification are related to really to the consumption attitude, how these customers consume, point of connection, what I already mentioned, the voltage levels, metering capacity or metering capabilities. can we measure really the demand, for example, the megawatts, yeah? The so-called interval metering, that's another point. Need of subsidies, which is a soft criteria, but sometimes used because we have to separate the group of customers if we want to subsidize them. That's another point, yeah? So, and all these kind of criteria together, kind of when we mix them and go step by step through them, they can lead us to the customer segmentation, yeah?
Constantin, when you say we want to make groups because we want to subsidize them,
yes.
Is the subsidy a political thing or a regulatory thing?
Yeah, I mean, typically, I would say the subsidy decisions related to the policymaking process.
Yeah.
A regulator, of course, is involved a lot, yeah, in terms of calculation, the levels, yeah. The difference is the shortfalls resulting from subsidy, probably the implementation schemes in the operational details. But in my view, I mean, sometimes you can see a bit mixing in terms of legislation, what is doing government, what regulator, yeah. It is not going to say that the practical implementation is always the same, yeah. But I would say, from my point of view, it is more policy-making decision, yeah. And then regulation is just supporting that, yeah. And ideally, I would say just the good regulation should focus on the economic principles of tariff setting. And for example, the support schemes, especially the social affordability issues, are coming from the policymaking process, and it will be better to implement them outside of the tariff setting process, if possible. Yeah. But it's good to say that, yeah, that it is difficult to implement because we see in many cases that also the tariffs, yeah, the tariff policy is influenced also substantially by decisions on related to social affordability or energy poverty, and at the end actually strongly related to the subsidy policy of the government, yeah. So it can happen that tariffs are distorted because of really just need to have this criteria there, or I mean, cross subsidy actually kind of, you can say, perpetuated all the time, so kind of they are really approved and also required, yeah. But back to your point, Len, I think it's more policy-making point here for government, and regulators kind of more kind of, let's say, related to operational details, yeah, of this subsidy.
There's another question. Robert, are you going to ask the question?
Well, I wrote it in the chat box more as a reflection because I really like what is being presented, and it's assuming indeed that there's a regulator that is mandated to do this kind of work. And in many islands, there is no regulator yet, and the government does not have access to financial information, at least not detailed financial information. Perhaps our speaker could reflect on this.
Yeah, what could you do, Constantin, in case this information is lacking? Does this team actually help them to see what kind of information they're looking for?
It actually, you can simplify. I mean, without information, it will be difficult to set tariffs, yeah? You need some minimum level of information. Of course, one can simplify, yeah? We know the systems, we've done several cases when you can just see that, I mean, the information really reporting is rather insufficient, yeah? Or you can, let's say, very poor in terms of quality, yeah? Not only the volume, but also quality is not good. At the end, actually, one can reduce the complexity. One can use, for example, kind of, let's say, simple single tariff structures. For example, energy tariffs, very kind of, let's say, simple tariffs, which do not require, for example, interval metering. They require some kilowatt hours reasonably metered, and also aggregate the customer groups to the minimum, to the disaggregate, or kind of aggregate them to the minimum possible extent. That's also possible, but at the end, actually, you have to have some information, yeah.
Yeah.
I think back to the point of Robert, probably I would say one can simplify, yeah, a lot, and kind of, let's say, really work with the kind of, let's say, very small volumes. One can approximate, yeah, can assume some things, also it's possible, but thinking at least for the cost, you can have to have some reporting on the cost and on the energy consumption. That will be really the basics here. To start doing something on the tariffs, yeah? And when I say cost, at least, for example, some data on the investments and also on the operational expenditures. I mean, what is labor costs, a bit services, some form of reporting, yeah? And just to connect now, I mean, regulatory reporting, yeah, is typically separated. It can be based on the financial reporting, yeah, the classical financial reporting for auditing purposes, yeah. And in this case, probably one can say, look, I think we don't have kind of, let's say, really specific regulatory templates. We don't have this degree of complexity and sophistication, but at least we can transform some data from the financial reporting which exists and make it valuable for the revenue and tariff setting process.
Yeah.
That will be probably, at the end, actually is a combination of pragmatism, I would say, some minimum data requirements and some assumptions.
Yeah. Okay.
Perhaps a final comment on this, just as a reflection. I think in the overseas countries and territories, you know, in many cases, we are still doing nation building. So we are overseas territories, but we do not have EU legislation. So each island has its own dedicated legislation, which in many cases is not as advanced as, you know, common European legislation. And the consequence of that is that a lot is missing. In this case, for example, if it's not embedded in legislation that utility companies should be transparent, they just don't have to do it. I know of cases where ministers are requesting information and they're getting a reply, no, we're not giving you because you're not entitled to ask this. And yeah, that is the OCTs. I think the importance of this program is that we are, first of all, creating the awareness of how the normal world is operating. For example, what is being presented today is how it should be done. And then we can see where are the gaps, you know, and what small steps can we take to build, especially at the institutional side, you know, the basics that are required to start migrating in this direction.
Probably, Robert, just to add something, is an excellent contribution, actually, what you say. I think the point here, of course, when I say pragmatism and minimum level of data should be connected with the right or the entitlement, you can say, of the government, if you don't have a specific institution, which is called regulator in this case, to require really to collect this information. So that's a really fundamental point, because as already said, it is difficult to start doing something without information. So the rights and the authority to require this information, to collect the data, even simple data with some simple templates, should be somewhere established in the legal framework. And that's actually a fundamental kind of point, which probably is the first one. I mean, back to the point of Len, actually what we're doing if we don't have information is to have this entitlement, kind of entitlement, it's kind of this authority, this power to collect information should be actually somewhere there. The institutional question, who is regulating, is a big one, but I think one can think in the first instance pragmatically. I mean, probably you know, in the debate in the world, independent regulator, government and regulator should be not one body. One can have a big philosophy about these things, indeed, but when we don't have anything, one can start first with governmental regulation, based on kind of, let's say, really just simple statements and also some rights to collect information, and then to increase the degree of sophistication of the institutional framework in the next stage, or further in the practice.
Konstantin, another question from Janet. Following on this, is there an exemplary region or case that you would recommend where it is working well? Ideally, an island that could be used as an example?
I mean, I think we have regulations, for example, again, a bit back to Europe, but we have, for example, in the Canary Islands, or for example, also Azores, we have also regulation. Of course, sometimes it's a bit connected to the mainland, but I think you have kind of, let's say, very reasonable principles of island regulations there, because they influence, in this case, by the continental principle of Spanish or Portuguese regulation. So that could be a good example of some operational rules. Actually, they benefit that taking the principles already of the continental regulation, but still applied in the case of small systems, I can say.
I can add to that, they might be exemplary for the part of the tariff that is related to the regulatory aspect. But when it comes, and if we don't have time to do that, I will send them separately. When it comes to the other policy-related questions that they put in it, I mean, I wouldn't say all European countries are so much of an example, Robert. I mean, we've seen tariffs where the policy pushes in things of which you can't even imagine that they should be in a tariff. And Italy is an amazing example in that. But
we can say we have our issues also in Europe.
Yeah,
definitely.
Yeah, but still I want to emphasize. No, but I mean, still I would like to emphasize, OCTs are really very different environment. Any EU island is not comparable to OCT. We must try to focus on examples from here because every EU-related island or even independent CIS have much more advanced legislation structures as compared to a lot. Now, of course, there's a big difference among the OCTs. There are 25. Some are far more advanced than others. I mean, Bonaire is, for example, far more advanced than Aruba. Bermuda is also very advanced. You know, so it's not all in one bucket. That's also very important to comment.
Yeah, Jeannie's talk yesterday was really showing off the case of Bermuda, Konstantin, and I mean they clearly know really well what they're doing, but also what they still have to do. So it's a really interesting case. I suggest we move on because otherwise we're going to be in time issues.
Was actually quite another one from. Okay, then just just I'll kind of let's say put these tables. I'll not go kind of let's say every single detail. We don't have the time, but I think it is good to know that this what's called tariff structure. You remember the third step, here. It is the last one when we allocate the cost to the clients and establish really the tariff structure, tariff design. We have several here decisions to make, And the first one is really what kind of charges we're using. You remember we said in the second step, if we have a good quality data, we can try to really distinguish or to allocate the cost to different demand drivers or cost drivers, kind of energy demand, or power demand, or kind of number of customers. And if we manage in this way, we can establish very nice cost-reflective tariff system, which includes different types of charges, Could include capacity charge or demand charge, energy charge, standing charge. So a combination, can separate by voltage level, can have a time of use element. So step by step, we can increase the complexity. But the first point is it requires information. And second, also, one point is that I think we can increase the complexity, but it's also good to consider that the customer should kind of, let's say, get good orientation, should understand, should feel well with the tariff system, and not kind of, let's say, be overwhelmed in this case, or kind of confronted with kind of, let's say, something which they really just consider as a black box, So better just to have kind of really this balance between, you can say, details, sophistication, or kind of, let's say, more pragmatic views, kind of, let's say, to see what is really the reasonable level. Otherwise, for every single charge, demand, energy, and standing, charge, you can have good arguments to use them, But also there are, of course, counter arguments. Thinking, for example, of demand charge. Demand charge means to have a financial unit per megawatt either measured or kilowatt measured or installed or contracted, It will be really a charge which is based on demand and not on energy. You can say chargeable quantity in this case. And there is a good or many good reasons to use them. But I think first you have to have this information. So you have to have the really information on the interval metering, which requires very good metering process. And second, of course, it can create some big differences in terms of financial burden. So one can think also properly what is really necessary, what is there as information on data, and then to decide. In many cases, one can start with energy charge, which will be reasonably cost reflective. It will be not perfect at all, it's clear, but it's implementable, it can work. And if you separate it by customer groups or by voltage level, it's already one big step towards cost reflectivity. And then step by step, with more data collected, with actually more accurate data, better quality of the data, better understanding, better communication and reporting process, one can start increasing the complexity of the tariff systems. And I mean, I'll skip this one. Then you have also 3 additional criteria, which it is good to consider when we're thinking to design the tariff system. Time of use, I think Glenn already mentioned this one. It is an important point. There is a reason that cost of supply in different time points, yeah? Especially thinking of fuel cost, it could also lead us to differences, yeah? But could be also other reasons to really also allocate in different ways the cost of infrastructure or the fixed cost, yeah? So that could lead us to have really time of use charges, yeah? Not all the companies apply them, but many of the companies apply them if they see that the cost really are different in the different time periods, yeah? So this time of use can be done on time of day, night, day, when we just define, for example, what is peak, what is off-peak, what is shoulder. Yeah, depends on the degree of complexity of the system. Could be on seasonal basis, could be also different. So that's kind of, let's say, just a matter of time resolution. But it's good just to know they exist. They used a lot in practice. Second one is geographical differentiation. You can see if you have a bigger territories, typically different regions will have kind of supply from different distribution companies. And for this reason, the cost will be different. That's why the tariffs can be also different. But if you have a small territory, island, or even a reasonably actually small territory, one can think of one price and actually it will be uniform price. So the discussion about geographical differentiation, it will be, in this case, probably irrelevant. And last but not least, what I mentioned already before, by voltage level, depending on the system, if you have a bigger system again, you can see clear difference between the transmission, then you can see distribution, and sometimes distribution has a high voltage, medium, and low voltage. So you can see the whole really kind of hierarchy of the networks. And for this reason, as already said, it makes sense, and it's done in the practice also, to establish voltage-specific tariffs, yeah? So tariffs differentiated by a voltage level of connection. But again, if the system is small and the network is very compact, yeah, in this case, one can think also that it will be not really a big advantage, or it will be not a big contribution to cost reflectivity if the system, in a small system, we don't have this separation, yeah, of the tariffs. Depends on the specific kind of, again, circumstances. Again, summarize here, when we just go for this step 3 to establish the tariffs, it is good to think what kind of tariff structure, energy, demand, or standing charges we're using, and whether we want to differentiate by time of use, by region, geographically, or by voltage level. That will be at least. Of course, the customer grouping is essential. We discussed it before. You have to have the list of your customer groups, how you're establishing the tariffs. And now we have also 2 slides, which sometimes are used by some regulators, because you've seen in the previous slide that everything what we explain is actually bottom up. We are starting from the cost. Then based on the cost, we establish the revenues and then the tariffs. And one can now go for a second big step here in the process and recheck these tariffs now in a top-down process. So we add a financial model in this case in the tariff setting process. And once we have established cost-based tariffs, yeah, we recheck their impact on the financial performance of the utility with the financial model. So in this case, we have kind of, let's say, 2-step process. The first one is a bottom-up, what I explained, revenue and tariff setting. And there is a second now step, which is called top-down, yeah, which is rechecking, kind of checking the impact of these tariffs on the financial performance. It's done by specific financial models. Actually, I'll not explain every single item because it's very kind of, let's say, technical, this one. But at the end, you can think in this way that we're checking really the financial performance. And when we say financial performance, we want to see specific financial parameters of the utility, which will indicate to us whether actually its position of this utility, financial position, is sound and healthy. Yeah, that's the idea beyond that. It could be profitability, liquidity, capital structure, several really financial performance ratios or criteria. But at the end, this check will help us as a regulator to understand that these tariffs, which we have established in the first step, kind of, let's say, will lead to a sound and reasonable financial performance. Yeah, that's kind of, let's say, yeah. And we have one last chapter kind of in the discussion, which is more related to the poverty and affordability, what I mentioned before. And that's why I just have kind of 2 slides here just to mention, because it's important. Yeah, the first 2 steps, so the discussion was how to establish cost reflective tariff. So we are starting from revenue setting, tariff. The idea actually is to have really cost reflective good tariffs, yeah, good regulation with good tariff setting process. However, as already discussed, it can happen that we have issues, not from the normative point of view of economics, yeah, that, I mean, but they related more to the social affordability and poverty. And of course, it is a problem here if, for kind of reason, the cost reflective tariffs calculated by the regulator cannot be implemented in this way, because we have poverty or issues with affordability. Now, I mean, that's kind of, let's say, area which we have to consider. As already said, this is a bit in addition to the classical economic objectives, yeah? What's called social political, they could have a different role, and typically they're with the government, as already discussed with in previous slides. But it should be mentioned because they're interacting a lot with the regulatory tariff policy, and they can have also a significant impact in the final, really, decision for the tariff setting. So I mentioned here 2 aspects which have more social dimension. It's affordability and poverty, yeah, in general. And also some other political, classical political, really just areas when we just connect the electricity pricing with the economic policy in the country. That's it's very important, yeah, what we want to achieve, yeah, or to the regional development, yeah. And actually, this is also everywhere. You can see this discussion now, even in Europe again, what is now with the tariff level and what is really the expected economic development in the regional policy. So that's why, I mean, this slide shows that, I mean, the tariff policy, regulatory tariff policy has kind of a bit broader connection or connections to other areas which are more in the governmental domain, so in the policy-making process of the government. And what can be done? I mean, of course, if you have kind of, let's say, issues with the customers, you have to first look who are these customers and just really just to define them, yeah, to find them and to think how you can define. There are different kind of models to define affordability. There are different definitions of affordability and vulnerability. That could be a really big area here to discuss how we define them and how we measure these aspects. But that will be important, yeah, just to understand. And in many cases, that could be not only a problem of energy or electricity pricing. This could be really just a general aspect, just to have a definition of really poor people and to think of or really of social support programs, which are not really electricity specific. Yeah, they could be really support programs, which actually covers everything. Yeah, from electricity to also kind of, let's say, paying the apartment rents or everything. Yeah, but that's actually a point which we have to know. Who is this actually? How we define them? And now, in terms of really support, you can see here in the design, I mentioned a couple of things. Some of them are tariff related, some not. Yeah, just kind of there for bullet points, but you can also have a long list here also of really measures. And I think we mentioned already the first one, Lifeline or block tariffs, which is a classical tool, yeah, classical to use, which is based on cross subsidies within the specific customer group. But it is used a lot, yeah. And it works in this way, what I already explained, that you're charging or you are differentiating the tariffs in dependence on the level of consumption. So it means when you increase the consumption, for example, monthly consumption, then you increase the tariff. So you have thresholds. In this case, you are charging higher consumption with higher tariff. The idea beyond that is actually that customers or residential consumers who consume more, they're probably wealthy or they're not so really poor. Yeah, that's the idea, how you correlate. Yeah, could be direct cash payments, which is a non-tariff policy, and these payments can be done from the budget. Yeah, that's a classical case when there is a money, there's a transfer, social transfers, yeah, from the budget, and it is not in this case, electricity specific. It is just transfer, for example, to the customers. They can be connected indeed with the electricity bills, yeah, just to pay the bill. But they can be also general money support coming from the budget in this case, because it can be spent for something else also. Could be vouchers, not indirect payments, could be also that's the same form, but actually it's probably just vouchers for specific really payments, not directly cash, but something which is kind of, you can say, with specific destination, specific objective to be used, yeah? Or could be social tariffs, which actually in this case, we reduce the tariff on purpose. The question is, if we use this tariff, of course, what will happen with the utilities revenue? Is it kind of, let's say, kind of compensated somewhere, or just will leave the companies without really sufficient revenues, which in a couple of years can lead really just to problems with maintenance and quality of supply? So that's kind of really big point here, what exactly is meant when we just say social tariffs and how they're implemented in the specific context. And then in any case, if we, for example, there is a need of kind of, let's say, these protection measures, it is good, as already mentioned, to define properly who is the beneficiary, who exactly, what is the eligibility, how we define who is eligible. That should be very transparent and clear. If, for example, if we're using lifeline tariff, what exactly is the minimum consumption level in this case? And then where is the funding coming from? If it's in tariff scheme, it is clear that it's in the tariff system, but we have to also think that that should be revenue neutral. So it means if we're increasing somewhere or reducing somewhere, the balance should be kind of proper. So if we go for social tariffs or for lifeline tariffs, that should be designed in this way that the total impact should really not affect the revenues significantly. If so, we can also really just create shortfalls, which is already discussed, it will be not desirable, especially if it's actually for a couple of years. So if it's outside of the tariff, that's okay. Then we don't have actually really issues with the tariff policy. But of course, the government should ensure that the money is there from the budget. So we have sufficient money in the public budget just to fund, for example, such protection schemes or protection measures for the consumers. So that was the last slide. Many thanks again on the presentation.
Many thanks to you, Konstantin.
And if you have any questions, we'll be very happy to
yeah. So if there are other questions, don't hesitate to put them in the chat. I suggest, although it was super interesting, that we go to Marieke because it immediately links to what we had as the last slides here. So I think that's a natural flow. Marieke.
I have to unmute. Can someone of your team share my presentation, or should I try? Usually using Zoom and sharing does have its challenges. But corporate computers.
Yeah, Laura or Sarah? Yeah.
I'm opening it.